So, hi, I'm Carol Lansing, History Department, University of California, Santa Barbara. And I'd like to begin by thanking Lucia and Alice for organizing what looks to be a fascinating symposium on consent. I'm delighted to be able to take part, and also for them reorganizing heroically to make it an online event. What I'll do in this lecture is to draw on my research on low status women in the town of Bologna, based in Bologna's famous criminal court records from the 13th century. What I'll do first is just talk about one case that I think sets out some of the features I want to discuss. Then I'd like to back up. I want to take a minute to talk about what I think is a cultural preoccupation with female consent and abduction and rape in this period. And to do that, I'll look at Dante's account of Piccarda Donati in Paradise in the Divine Comedy. Then I'll turn just briefly to court procedure in order to explain how the evidence I'm discussing was created and what its weaknesses are. And then finally, I'll get to the main point, which is to talk about first an elite case of an abducted girl, which I think is a textbook example of how young elite women were treated, and then women from low status and also very young women, victims or alleged victims of rape. So let me share my screen. So consent in class in Bologna's criminal court. In 1285, an innkeeper notified Bologna's criminal court of a rape in his hostel. When Zanos, the man who was accused of the rape, was questioned by the judge, he testified that he'd met Devizia, who's termed in this case a puella, a girl without kin or resources evident in the material. He met her in a man's house in town, warned her that she was terribly vulnerable, and then asked her to come and live with him in his village as his amica, or more commonly, amazia. Zano stated to the court that he told Devizia if she became his amica, once he had children from her, he would have just cause to ask his father's permission to marry her without a dowry. When the judge questioned Devizia, she testified that yes, she had agreed to his promise of marriage, but that when he had sex with her without having a marriage, it was rape because she did not consent. This case introduces several themes I will discuss. Again, Devizia is represented as a puella, which means that she was somewhere between 11 and 13 years old, with no good options, no mention of resources or kin. And Zanos stated probably did want her to be his amica or amazia. These were women who lived outside of marriage and had sex, or at least had sex outside of marriage. They include women who lived as co-residential concubines, women who had independent lovers and worked in other ways. Some were part-time sex workers. Married women with a lover also sometimes were called women with amazios. The male form of this term is amazio. Given her circumstances, if Zanos was truthful, this might have been a good idea for her because her options were poor. And the case also underscores the ambiguity of consent. Was this a genuine misunderstanding of the terms of the deal in which she consented because she thought Zanos had promised marriage, while he thought he'd explained that he could not marry without his father's permission? Or was he just spinning a good yarn in order to seduce her, or perhaps found a way to persuade the judge to absolve him of the rape? I think there is a contemporary preoccupation with women's consent to rape and abduction in this period. And Dante's presentation of Piccarda Donati in the Divine Comedy certainly suggests ambivalence. Piccarda was a Franciscan nun whose brother Corso Donati had her abducted from her convent and forced to marry the Rossellino della Tosa, the nephew of one of Corso's brutal political allies. As Piccarda, the character states, God knows what then my life became. Dante actually knew her. His wife was her cousin, and another brother, Forese Donati, was a close friend. Dante, the poet, placed her in paradise, but in the lowest circle because she had broken her vow, along with one other nun, as you see from the illustration. Dante, the pilgrim, is represented as very troubled by this. And his guide, Beatrice, states his question: if my goodwill persists, why should the violence of others cause the measure of my merit to be less? Beatrice then spends an entire canto explaining it in terms of a distinction between absolute and relative will. Briefly, because Picarda yielded, her will was relative because it abetted force. And perhaps it's because of the ambivalence that Dante then used her to portray joyful acceptance and identification with God's will and justice. Picarda is perfectly content and rejoices in the justice of God. Ironically, Corso Donati was serving as Bologna's podesta when he had his sister abducted, which means that he was the executive in charge of the courts, and together with his judges was adjudicating rape cases. Rape in the courts, like marriage, hinged on consent. While, as you know, the Roman law definition of rape in terms of raptus, abduction, stuprum, defilement, was notoriously vague, and that's reflected in the statutes. I mean, Bologna's statute is equally vague, just speaks of raptus. The court, in practice, used a precise formula drawn from contemporary legal manuals. Rape was carnal knowledge with force against the victim's will. And of course, in most rape cases, the force is obvious, but there had to be testimony that the woman did not consent. It was against her will. That could take the form of calling for help, a cor uomo. It could also take the form of physical resistance. And there, just I couldn't resist. There's an image from the Lorenzetti frescoes in the Siena's public palace, which represents, I think, a raptus, a woman being abducted. In Bologna, rape cases were surprisingly common. In 3 years during the 1280s, there are, in the extensive surviving registers, at least 95 rape and attempted rape cases, 60 of them accusation procedure, and 35 inquisitions. What's the difference? Okay, let me talk then just briefly about procedures. In accusation cases, these were a legal mechanism people could use to resolve their conflicts. They were filed by the alleged victim or her representative, and were usually brief. They had to pay a notary to write out a libellus that simply stated what they saw to be the facts of the case. Again, proof of non-consent generally meant that the victim could prove that she cried for help and resisted, and there had to be witness testimony to that point. It couldn't simply be her word. Why so many accusation cases? As Massimo Vallerani has shown, the 13th century Bolognese court was remarkably accessible. Accusations were cheap and easy in the early stages. In rape cases, the accused man very rarely showed up. He then was contumacious. Contumacy was considered an admission of guilt, and he would be banned and outlawed in absentia to suffer a heavy penalty if he were captured. And I've come to think that this may have been the point. That is, that savvy Bolognese women knew about it and used rape accusations to drive a violent man out of the neighborhood. After all, if he was contumacious, she could simply drop the charge and pay a tiny fine of 20 soldi, and with luck, he was gone. The cases I am discussing here are inquisitions. Again, these are 35 of these cases. This procedure was a 13th century invention and intended not so much to resolve conflicts as to maintain public order and punish those found guilty of crimes that were detrimental to the commune. Inquisitions could be ex officio, or they could be sparked because someone, often the parish minister, made a notification or perhaps a denunciation to the court. The notifier or denouncer could be anonymous and did not represent the interests of the alleged victim, who might well disagree. Crucially, it was the investigation and questions of the judge rather than the accuser which drove the trial. And it's for that reason that testimony in Inquisition cases can reveal not only gossip, social sexual attitudes, differences of opinion, and also people's calculations. In a very few rape inquisitions, the alleged victims came from elite or very prosperous families, families which might hesitate to charge rape and perhaps attempt to conceal it. As you know, there's a large body of scholarship on this. Scholars have argued that family honor was closely bound up with female sexuality, and a rape affected not only the woman's status and marriage prospects, but the honor of the entire family. So they had a strong incentive to not charge rape. One inquisition did investigate the raptus or abduction of a young girl from an elite family who lived in a rural villa. And again, as I said before, it seems to me a textbook account of what the response of an elite family looked like. 3 men carried off Bettina de Gualenguis, she has a surname, and in a house in a nearby village, one of them, Ugolino, put a ring on her finger and asked her to consent to him as her husband. She remained silent. Meanwhile, there was a big hue and cry. 3 heavily armed men on horseback, one of them her cousin, Gualengo, accompanied by armed foot soldiers, were searching for her and came to this village. Chaos of some sort must have ensued. She managed to run away and hid in a sheep shed. She was coaxed out by her friends, but somehow Ugolino managed to grab her again. When Bettina's cousin told Ugolino to hand her over, he refused because he said they had consented, they were wed, they had consented to marriage. That ploy simply failed. He was contumacious, banned, and outlawed to be decapitated if caught, so a very severe penalty for abduction. Again, then, Bettina is a clear case of an elite young woman. She had titled relatives. She presumably had a substantial dowry. When she was abducted, her male relatives launched a serious pursuit and did rescue her. Further, none of the witnesses from the village suggested that she had consented. She was a carefully protected elite girl. And here, just for fun, is an illustration of raptus of abduction from an illustrated version of Gratian's De Cretum. It's now in the Fitzwilliam collection at Cambridge. And you can see in the illustration itself, first you see the father with the girl and then a young man standing there. Second image, he's coaxing her with food. Third image, he's having sex with her, presumably rape. And then finally there you see the father hauling him before a judge. So there's an illustration of raptus. At lower social circles, consent might well be debated. And I'm going to talk about Inquisitions, the abduction and rape of Horabella in a village in the countryside, which I find puzzling. The victim alone claimed that this was consensual. The notifier, who was anonymous, stated that Jacopo with 2 other men approached Horabella at a fountain. Jacopo forcibly carried her off to his house, where he had carnal knowledge with force against her will. When the judge questioned the first witness, the girl's father, he said that the notification was true, but he did not know whether or not she had consented. So the father is ambivalent. Then Horabella told a very different story. Jacopo came to me at the fountain and said, I want you to come with me to my house and stay as my wife, as other women stay with their husbands, because I have publicly betrothed you, as you know. Horabella reported that she responded, Bene, I want to come with you and do everything just as other women do with their husbands. They went to his house where he immediately had carnal knowledge with her consent, and they, quote, treated each other as husband and wife. When Horabella was asked by the judge whether Jacopo had in fact betrothed her, she said yes, last June, so about 4 months before, by my father's will and in his house with over 40 witnesses. The judge then investigated, questioning 12 more witnesses, all of whom described Horabella desperately resisting. She had a companion, a Domina Benvenuta, who said that when Jacopo asked her to come with him, Horabella laughed at him. Several witnesses described Jacopo then dragging her by her hair or her arm as she cried out for her father, omi pater. Another witness testified that he had encountered her mother, who was yelling, "A cor uomo, help, they have taken my daughter." Jacopo was summoned, did not show up, was provisionally banned for contumacy in 500 libra, which was about half the fine this judge usually imposed in rape cases. So what was going on? Well, perhaps Ottobello sought to cover up a rape as consensual married intercourse, and even backdated a well-witnessed betrothal before a few months before, because it was less damaging to honor. But what then of her father's ambivalence and all the witness testimony to force and resistance? Possibly there had been a betrothal, but Ottobello did not want a consummated marriage until Jacobus Raptus forced her to submit and make the best of a bad deal. But if so, why did her father not support her story? It's a puzzling case. And I want to point out also that Jacopo's, contumacy did not necessarily imply guilt. An appearance in court was risky. It also involved posting an expensive surety and providing witnesses who also had to post surety. So he simply may not have been able to do that. I'm hoping for comments on this case, by the way, that you guys will tell me what you think might have actually taken place, or different ways to read it. What are the experience of lower status women? It's dramatically different from the elite Bettina de Gualenguis. Low status often cannot be securely identified, but there are clues. In 15 of the 35 Inquisition cases in this sample, there's no evidence that the alleged victim had a living father or was or had been married. In 2 cases, they're even identified with matronymics, which suggests that the mother was unmarried. In 4 cases, the notifier was actually the victim or alleged victim, suggesting a lack of kin or other support. 6 are identified as puellae, that is very young girls, and 4 of the puellae were almost certainly domestic servants. Again, a puella was roughly 12 years old and quite possibly had not yet gone through her first menstrual cycle. The rape, or if consensual, the debauch of a virgin puella in law was termed an enorme delictum, a very great crime. In a number of these cases, someone, probably the parish official, notified the court of the abduction and rape, but some witnesses said, no, the girl ran away to the man. In one case, someone notified the court that 3 university students, remember this is a university town in the 13th century, 3 students from other parts of Italy, led by Maxino, had abducted Margherita, a puella who lived with her mother and brother in the central parish of Santa Tecla, and called it an enorme delictum. The mother, however, denied the raptus in her testimony. Instead, she stated she'd been out walking with the girl in the street and the girl simply ran away. Witnesses testified that Margherita had become Maxino's co-residential amazia, eating, drinking, and having sex with him. But the mother differed. She had heard that he did have sex with her, but did not keep her at his residence, which is fairly plausible given that he was a university student. In another case, Buvalello, whose father was titled, this guy's an elite, was charged with kidnapping Gisela, again the daughter of a widow, taking her to his residence and raping her. 3 of 4 witnesses testified that Gisela had been willing and that Buvalello keeps her as his woman and amazia. There is no evidence in this testimony of any attempt to recover them. Overall, in 6 cases, the witnesses differed on consent, whether the girl was willing or even chose to run away. So again, a woman named Borghizia, again, pretty low status, notified the court that Domenico and his brother had abducted her daughter Caracosa from a house in a village where she was probably working as a domestic. Borghizia stated that this had been against her will, against her maternal will. Domenico and his brother are now keeping her daughter Caracosa in her house. Caracosa's brother testified that the raptus was forcible and against Caracosa's will, and the girl's employer concurred. However, a local woman reported what maybe was gossip. The sister of Domenico, the abductor, had told her that in fact, Caracosa went willingly. Why might people consent? or run away. I think that tensions over the restriction on marriage underlie some of these cases. Young men and women demonstrably could be frustrated because they were unable to marry or held in kind of perpetual adolescence. A young man could be held back by a family or lacked resources. And in several cases, a man carried off a woman, like Zanos, explicitly saying that he wanted a wife. In a dramatic case, a man was lured to his death by the promise of a wife. And a fellow told the victim that if he came to his village, he would give him his beautiful cousin as a wife. When the poor fellow agreed and headed for the village to get the wife, he was slaughtered along the way by apparently the man who had lured him. Females who consented or ran away to a man surely at times had very poor marriage prospects or believed that they did. And in 3 cases, these were orphan nieces living with their uncles who ran away. In a case involving stolen goods, the thief turned out to be the orphan Johanna, purportedly, according to the testimony, 10 years old, who lived with her maternal uncle, who was a prosperous notary. Conniving with a female neighbor, Johanna stole valuable clothing and a gold ring from her uncle's house, ran away, and stayed at the house of a woman named Bonissima at the neighbor's urging. She planned, she testified, to give the goods to Gregory, whom she said had lain with her and had promised to marry her. The stolen goods were to be her dowry. So she's recruiting her own dowry by robbing her uncle so that she'll be able to marry. Instead, what happened was that Bonissima's household divided up the goods and handed Johanna over to a man who was to lead her to Ravenna, purportedly to meet the conniving neighbor. Surely what was happening was Johanna was being trafficked. This appeared before the existence of civic brothels, but there is considerable evidence of the purchase and sale of women in this period. The 2 were captured, Johanna and the man who's leading her to Ravenna. They were handed over to the Bolognese court. Again, there's no evidence that the uncle sought to recover her. He did clearly understate her age, calling her 10 years old. She must have been older. And perhaps that was in the hopes of lighter treatment by the court. Johanna was independent and perhaps thought her marriage prospects were poor. And of course, she also was terribly gullible. What happened then to young female runaways? Some became co-residential concubines or amaziae, providing sex and probably domestic help. And they and any children they had in the union would have no legal rights, but their circumstances might be relatively secure and stable, at least until the lover chose to contract or was able to contract a legal marriage and therefore throw them out. Further, many women termed amaziae lived independently. They're fascinating, sometimes in a household with other women, or perhaps even on their own. There's one example of a woman who has an amazio. He doesn't live with her. She lives in her own house. People pay her to stable their horses and perhaps to stay there. He comes and stays sometimes, but he lives with his father. Amaziae would have a lover or several lovers who gave them some resources and also would support themselves in various ways, very much including sex work. I'm suggesting then that when the student Maxino had sex with the runaway Margarita, but did not keep her in his residence, she in fact was following this independent pattern. So she may not be set up to be trafficked into prostitution or sold, but rather becoming, like many other women, an independent amazia. I want to finish with a terrible case. Consent to sex could, of course, possibly be disastrous. And this is the case of Lucia Muta. It is also a reminder of the horrific brutality that might follow sexual consent. Lucia, as her nickname suggests, was mute. She, by the way, she's clearly well known in Bologna. They refer to her as Muta or La Muta. Her father was dead. She had no resources, and she evidently lived by selling sex and by begging. One night, 3 men took her and bought her dinner at a tavern and then took turns essentially raping her. Witnesses spoke of hearing her ululating. She could not talk, but she was able to wail or howl. The court brought in 2 expert witnesses, a midwife and a physician, who examined Lucia and stated that her vagina and perineum were so badly torn that she was close to death. My point then is that she tragically must have initially consented to this and suffered this horrible fate. I'm very much hoping that I will be able to, not now, but I will be able to get questions from you, comments, and especially suggestions. And I want to thank you. I also can't resist finishing with this image, which you may not know, from San Gimignano. This is the bedroom of the podestà, the executive who ran the courts, and there he is, clearly having relations with a woman who could not possibly be his wife. So it's a rare kind of a racy image of a podestà. This is exactly, by the way, what they were not supposed to do. So thank you very much.